It's quite late in the evening, afternoon period. But hopefully everyone's hanging in there and recovering from the shocking news of Brazil exiting the World Cup and Morocco still being in contention. Should be a fairly interesting couple of days, at least on the football front. Anyway, Assalamualaikum, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. My name is Dr. Alif. I'm here on behalf of my team and on behalf of my esteemed leader, Dr. Shaza as well. Thank you, IIIT, for the opportunity, assistance as well, and of course the chance to briefly share with our fellow colleagues what we've done in the last couple of months. On our paper titled The Application of Maqasid al-Shari'ah in Multicultural Malaysia, Developing Strong Institutions for Interethnic Unity. Alhamdulillah, it's culminated in this paper we've written, and of course this paper currently is under consideration for publication with Contemporary Islam, and we'll see where it goes from that point on. So just to give you a sort of outline of what you hear from me, we'll see a bit about the objectives and the background of the paper, and then of course I'll share with you the key insights that we've gained from our interviews. So roughly speaking, the first portion will say a bit about the basics of and the puzzle of the paper, and of course towards the end we'll share with you what we've discovered and uncovered upon speaking to the members of parliament and so on that we've spoken to. So in our infancy, right, this paper, we began with a kind of puzzle. Essentially the puzzle was how Islamic law can be understood in its universal and holistic objectives in order to allow non-Muslims to live peacefully and confidently under a Muslim majority government. Of course, all the while having in mind that the typical answer to this question usually stems from a focus on Muslim minorities living under non-Muslim authorities, right? Because the typical shape is almost a kind of inversion of the position that we've taken. Of course, in the case of Muslim minorities living in non-Muslim authorities, the absence of the existence of Islamic laws being part of government's priority is of course not there. But for us, of course, the inverted question is equally as interesting. How does a Muslim majority country function in the context of how it deals with or balances having sort of non-Muslim minorities living within its society? So for us, and of course, Dr. Shaza as well, arguably quite insightfully, the hope was to thicken a kind of pathway where Maqasid al-Shari'ah may provide Malaysians room to, of course, ultimately be able to see one another without suspicion, and where perhaps Maqasid al-Shari'ah may be employed as a kind of framework in policies of government, particularly in reducing any rising inter-ethnic tensions through a more sort of determined willingness among our political leaders of any color, race, creed, religion, and so on and so forth. And of course, the attempt to apply the Maqasid sort of approach to the benefit of the multicultural population in Malaysia. A more sort of sensible understanding of Maqasid, we felt, seemed common sense, in order to open and further open the possibilities of things like good governance, even if it's explicitly or obviously Islamic in nature. Why? Well, one wouldn't be sort of foolish to think that a multicultural place like Malaysia, perhaps it's sort of preferable for the government to put into policies and put effect policies that achieve the higher objectives of Sharia that's more universal in nature. And we'll see later on, of course, a kind of lean more towards spirit rather than terminologies. All right. Of course, in the paper we get into more detail and trace further the discussion on Maqasid al-Shari'ah as a kind of framework, and of course there's a section on interethnic relations in Malaysia, and then a discussion on our coexistence. But for today, I think we'll focus on what we've uncovered through the interviews, because I think what we found from our interviews with policymakers were rather quite interesting. So between the 10th of March 2021 and the 4th of October 2021, for about a duration of 7 months, 13 interviews were conducted with members of parliament from various political parties across the spectrum. 12 were at the time members of parliament. One was previously a deputy minister of Islamic affairs in Malaysia. One non-Muslim, one female from East Malaysia as well, of course, Malaysia being East and West. So 13 participated in our interview. To begin with, most of these interviews interviewees agreed that the interethnic relations in Malaysia at the moment is quite under control. So you had individuals like Amin Ahmad and so on summing up the situation in Malaysia as individuals having a kind of difference or differences in opinion, while at the same time never resolving it through violent means, because of course that's the kind of recognition that in parts coexistence means recognizing that differences will indeed always exist, but the key is to not allow it to be resolved by a kind of violent sort of solution. There were also sort of interviewees like Fahmi Fazil, the former Prime Minister of Malaysia twice in office, Mahathir Mohamad, who when we spoke to compared Malaysia, of course, with other countries, particularly America, when making the point that interethnic relations in Malaysia is manageable. But of course, while this was the case, the recognition is quite manageable, several of these interviewees sort of pointed out that there's a kind of fragility that still exists in the country. Several of them were quick to point out that there's a kind of vulnerability in the relationship among different ethnicities in Malaysia, and of course can be exploited equally easily, especially by ruthless sort of politicians. Salahuddin Ayub, when we spoke to, highlighted what he calls time bomb issues. Amrun Hamza, when we were speaking to him, sort of recognized that there are times when certain segments of society will trigger the sentiment of race and ethnicity. Masli Malik as well, from IIUM, and of course we know his career, points out, of course, of late, recently, politics, or what he calls late politics, has completely ruined the harmony that exists, or what he calls muhibba, in society, and he's calling for sort of improvement. I'd like to share one sort of quote as well. Nick Nazmi, the former MP for Setiawangsa as well, described the situation in following terms. He said, for most people, the need or the impulse to play the racial religious card or engage in divisive language in order for survival, particularly by individuals or parties from the opposition, because of course parties tend to be very vocal about racial and religious issues, especially when they're in opposition. He said this is, of course, something to be taken note of. And both politicians and also the business community have to eventually come to address the issues, despite the language, despite the race biting, ultimately have to come and address the issue of economic inequality, because these issues, of course, are pressing. And ultimately, in addressing things like economic inequality, for Nick Nazmi at least, he was saying, we need to go back to Maqasid al-Shari'ah, because ultimately in these types of things, we are essentially talking about life, about property. And these are points that cut across the discussion, either side of the coin. And then, of course, former Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad and Salahuddin Ayub also felt the same, particularly on the point of the porous nature of interethnic relations in Malaysia, and it really stemming from socio-economic structures of the country. And of course, then, as a result, becoming kind of serious issue and a serious need arises, which policymakers eventually have to focus on, and particularly again on the point of the economy, because again, in dealing with the economy, we're dealing with the protection of wealth here as well. So the point again cuts across either side of the coin, and it's also acknowledged by our politicians. So, in other words, if of course, as we're looking at this, as we're getting the response, we felt like if Maqasid is eventually be used as a kind of framework to sort of foster better inter-ethnic relations in Malaysia, a focus on economic equality to reduce any tensions seemed to be necessary. So the protection of wealth seemed to be the key, a kind of cornerstone in reducing the interethnic tensions as well. So we found that Malaysian policymakers across the political spectrum tended to agree in applying the Maqasid approach in legislating, as if they sort of kind of thing that's functioning in the background as they're sort of moving along in life and sort of legislating. And of course, in the context of a multicultural country as Malaysia, applying the Maqasid seems not out of place. But the peculiar trade-off was, while they behave as if they understood or tended to sort of agree that the application of Maqasid in legislating seems necessary, they also understood that there isn't necessarily a need of specifying such an attempt as a kind of Maqasid al-Shari'ah sort of approach, right? For fear of upsetting the non-Muslims. So it's a bit like a halfway sort of situation that, they recognize that there's a need. However, that need has to be tempered by letting go of the need of specifying such a attempt as a kind of Maqasid sort of attempt. So generally speaking, the politicians tended to agree that the use of Maqasid as a framework in Malaysia should focus more on substance over sort of form. All right. And then again, even when we spoke to Liu Xintong, of course, non-Muslim, the recognition sort of cut both ways as well. A kind of recognition that Maqasid is basically to deal with larger questions of politics, larger objectives, notions of humans living together, moving towards a good livelihood, living harmoniously, having kind of meaningful and purposeful life. In politics, essentially themes or points that exist in the Maqasid approach, even if we don't, again, necessarily call it a kind of Maqasid approach. So for us, it appeared like there exists a kind of clear opportunity for cross-party collaboration in instituting Maqasid al-Shari'ah as a kind of framework to improve inter-ethnic relations in Malaysia. And of course, perhaps without necessarily having to specify specific labels, particularly to ease the anxieties of non-Muslims, and especially non-Muslims, or especially those from East Malaysia who might feel intimidated by the mere sort of expression. Again, the key, of course, is a kind of stress on spirit rather than terminologies. And then later on, of course, individuals like Fadli Shari, when we interviewed him, felt that when we talk about the Maqasid al-Shari'ah, we don't necessarily have to highlight the name, but we should sort of recognize that even if without the name, if the goal is achieved in itself, Maqasid al-Shari'ah has been achieved anyway. Right? But all of them tended to agree that education of the masses seems to be key in the acceptance all throughout Malaysia in general, either through attempts at popularizing the term or politicians educating their followers, or a kind of continuous determined usage of even the term Maqasid more widely as a kind of general practice. Just to sort of move into the concluding portions, Nick Nazmi, Amin Ahmad, Hassan Bahrom, individuals that we spoke to all agreed that that the Malaysian constitution as it is and how Malaysia is run at the moment already upholds key points, in essence highlighting that Maqasid is already in action in Malaysia, particularly in major things like the constitution. As part of protection of religion, the right of Muslims are protected to practice Islam, and of course other religionists as well, to have their freedoms accorded, accordingly, and very much sort of respected in the current form of the Malaysian constitution. And then when we speak about Hifz al-Nas, for instance, protection of life, the safety of people and the lives of individuals is quite sort of guaranteed as well in the constitution. And many of the laws, the enactments and regulations that exist already in Malaysia seem to already sort of uphold Maqasid sort of principles. And then when we spoke to, just finally, when we spoke to two different groups who've had experience in implementing Maqasid al-Shari'ah, in terms of implementation of Maqasid al-Shari'ah by different governments in Malaysia. We can, of course, in the paper, you can see, we can compare the responses by Mujahid Yusof Rawah, who was the former sort of de facto Minister of Islamic Affairs during the Pakatan Harapan government, not this one, the previous one, 18 to 2020. And then on the other hand, the other side of the spectrum, we spoke to Ashraf Wajdi as well, former Deputy Minister of Islamic Affairs during the Barisan Nasional sort of government around about 2015, 2018. Both of them were quite adamant that each side or each sort of type of government were very much involved in implementing Maqasid al-Shari'ah, although with different interpretations. But again, it proves the point for us, that cuts both ways. So while what I've shared today, with, of course, this opportunity given, again, thank you very much, I may not have done justice necessarily to all the efforts of those involved, IIIT, our esteemed colleagues who've helped us, our research assistant, Shaza, who's there today, and of course, all of those who have supported us in its entirety. I would like to encourage that this work receive its necessary or appropriate attention and readership accordingly. In our view, Malaysian politicians appear to understand that fiqh ayush, that the Maqasidic sort of approach, in substance, these things they tend to understand, or they at least display that they have a sort of decent understanding of it. But the application of it, of Maqasid al-Shari'ah as a kind of framework to improve interethnic relations, actually also relies on the reality, ultimately, of Malaysia in general, where typically we see religious issues, attempts to be more emotive, are sort of used as a kind of instrument by politicians for ultimately political mileage. So there's a kind of understanding. However, in a sense, there's a kind of ignorance or carelessness about it, as if pretending as if it's not there in the mind, so to speak. So we feel ultimately, if politicians continue to prioritize winning votes over security and stability, the application of Maqasid al-Shari'ah, to improve the relations between the ethnic groups, will ultimately take some time before it can come to fruition. Again, I'd like to thank you very much all the parties involved. We look forward to, I'm sure, any future collaborations. And then thank you for your time, and thank you for your patience.